Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Trump gambles the world economy on shutting down Iran's ability to sell oil overseas. And also this week, an indestructible phone screen, a Chinese tech giant, and an FBI sting. We talked to the inventor who suspects his technology was stolen. Donald Trump's attempts to make Iran abandon its nuclear ambitions and change its foreign policy is fraught with danger. After ripping up a nuclear agreement with Tehran, Trump is forcing China, India and Turkey to end their imports of crude from the Islamic Republic. Trump is gambling that there's enough oil from the US, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to fill the void. But global supplies could be upended by events in Venezuela and Libya, meaning that Trump is pushing the world's economy to the brink. We've got three reports for you. From Beijing, Katrina Yu on Beijing's dilemma. China is Iran's biggest oil buyer, but it's entering another round of trade talks with the US. And from the Straits of Hormuz, Zain Basravi reports on Iran's plans to block sea lanes. But we start with Mike Hanna in Washington on Saudi Arabia's role in US foreign policy.
It was a surprise to many when President Trump chose Riyadh as a destination of his first international trip in office. But 2 years on, it's clear this was more of a signal as to the central role Saudi Arabia would play in his administration's decision-making. Driven home when it was made clear the imposition of full oil sanctions against Iran was done in coordination with Riyadh.
I'll leave others to talk about the details of what the Saudis and the Emiratis have agreed to, but I've had conversations, the president has had conversations with these countries, and they have committed to making sure that there is a sufficient supply in the markets.
Confirmation of Saudi coordination came just days after President Trump signaled a major policy reversal in Libya, in an obvious nod to Riyadh, expressing US support for the Saudi-backed warlord fighting the internationally recognized government in Tripoli.
The announcement makes clear that Saudi Arabia is now a fulcrum of United States foreign policy. This despite the fact that Congress has held Saudi Arabia responsible for the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, as well as for the deaths in that ongoing war in Yemen. Even senior Republican leaders have said until these situations are resolved, responsibility for the murder of Khashoggi is assigned. It simply cannot be business as usual. The White House simply ignores this position.
A congressional resolution condemning Saudi Arabia's actions in Yemen, the subject of presidential veto. In President Trump's eyes, it seems the relationship with Riyadh more important than that with Congress.
In Dalian, one of China's most important ports, some 20 million barrels of Iranian oil are reportedly stranded, waiting to clear Chinese customs. With the United States ending waivers on Iranian oil purchases this week, the future of the shipment is unclear. The US has threatened sanctions on all countries that continue to buy Iranian oil after the 1st of May. That includes China, Iran's biggest customer. Beijing says there's no justification for the US policy.
China firmly opposes the unilateral sanctions and the so-called long-arm jurisdictions imposed by the US.
Roughly a quarter of Iran's exported oil is sold to China, about 500,000 barrels a day. The two countries have grown closer in recent years. President Xi Jinping met his Iranian counterpart Hassan Rouhani in Beijing last June, just 1 month after the US reimposed sanctions on Iran. Iran is a key supporter of China's Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative, designed to ease Chinese global trade. But analysts say China may have no option but to bow to US demands.
The United States is serious and forcing China to pick a side. The Chinese government has to be very careful.
The timing is critical. This week, top negotiators from Washington arrived in Beijing for a new round of trade talks. Both sides are working to finalize a deal to end escalating tit-for-tat tariffs, which began last year. Experts say China may give up Iranian oil, which makes up about 7% of China's total oil imports, to avoid jeopardizing discussions on trade.
For China now, the most important relation is still, it's not with Iran, it's with the US. And there are other battles China needs to fight in terms of, for example, transformative technology like 5G. China needs desperate some sort of cutting slack from the US.
Should China stop buying Iranian oil, it could compensate Tehran by boosting trade in other areas. If it continues, it could do so via a back door or barter for it with other goods. China has so far given no indication it intends to stop buying Iranian oil, leading some to believe it may be used as a bargaining chip in trade negotiations with the US. Washington officials, however, say any wind-down period or additional waiver is out of the question for China.
So far, Iran has responded to U.S. economic pressure with rhetoric at home and diplomacy abroad. But since the U.S. said it will not extend sanctions waivers to let Iran sell oil to its biggest clients, Iranian leaders have started hinting at slowing traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. An estimated 20% of the world's oil passes through these waterways. The mere mention of the name can move markets and raise concerns in global capitals. While leaders say if Iran can't use the strait to sell its oil, no one can, they also say they intend to keep the shipping lanes near their shores wide open in everyone's best interest. But behind balanced remarks, in the waters near Iran's southern coast, are battle-ready boats.
This is as close as we can get to an Iranian warship. The Navy takes the security of its vessels very seriously, especially around the waters of the Strait of Hormuz, where boats like this have the job of policing traffic in the waterway, but also looking out for American warships.
At any time, there are dozens of cargo ships visible on the horizon, giving a sense of how much traffic these waterways see on a daily basis. The message here is, Iran considers itself in charge of these waters. In the middle of all this is the small but strategic Hormuz Island. In the 17th century, it was home to a fort for the Portuguese Navy. One local guide says it's still the perfect place to monitor and control traffic in the strait. Some living here worry a conflict could make their quiet island a flashpoint.
Yes, we are concerned. If it happens, nothing will remain here. Our families and lives will be destroyed.
Others doubt it will come to that.
So far, there hasn't been any conflict here as long as I remember. I don't have any concerns. Maybe some people do, but as far as I can remember, nothing has happened to make us worry.
This coastline doesn't have any hotels and it's not teeming with any beachgoers. The scenic island remains largely undeveloped, perhaps by design.
We're at the southernmost point of Hormuz Island now, and the waves washing up against this rocky beach. That water is from the Strait of Hormuz. This is the strait just here. And it is a very picturesque setting. There are tourists that are coming through in buses. It is a very nice place, but make no mistake, for the Iranian government, this place serves the function of a pressure point.
Backed into a corner, Iran's leaders say they will respond and the U.S. will be to blame for whatever comes next. They point to centuries-old places like this as a reminder that they've faced foreigners at their shores before, and if pushed, they can do it again.
So, what will be the impact on the global economy, and do sanctions hurt the nation imposing them? In this case, should Iran carry out its threat to blockade the Persian Gulf? For that matter, what if oil stops flowing from other hotspots like Libya and Venezuela? Well, oil prices could shoot up to $100 a barrel. That could shave 0.6% off world growth, and inflation could rise by 0.7%. Stretched US consumers have already seen gas prices rise 7% this month to $2.89 a gallon. They could rise further, crimping growth. Since the US cut ties with Iran after the 1977 revolution, it's been estimated to have lost export revenues of $175 billion from 1995 to 2012. That translates into 66,000 job opportunities lost on average per year. Joining us now from Washington, D.C. via Skype is Dr. Sara Vakshuri. Sara is the founder and president of SVP Energy International. Good to have you with us once again, Sara. Oil prices have risen by, a third this year, in part due to these sanction waivers. What are the consequences for the world economy of these full sanctions now being implemented?
Well, on the world economy, if the sanctions cause a price spike, then it's going to have impacts on the world economy, of course. Well, at this point, U.S. administration is hoping that Saudi Arabia, UAE, OPEC members would increase their production, and they're hoping that there's not going to be a significant price rise from the sanctions in May. We shall wait and see.
But Saudi Arabia says that it's not ready to make up the lost production from Iran, and that the US could only, replace about a quarter of that? I mean, this isn't looking good, is it?
Well, first of all, to begin with, can U.S. substitute Iranian oil? Really no, because the crude quality matters, and Iranian crude oil is heavy, U.S. crude oil is light. Really, the best match for Iranian crude oil is Saudi crude oil, and the closest the other is UAE. So these are the closest crude types to Iranian crude quality for the refiners. Refineries cannot easily change their diet. But what we are expecting is that Saudi Arabia, before November, before the first sets of sanctions implementation in 2018, it raised its production, but suddenly it was surprised by the 8 waivers that were announced by the U.S. administration. So this time they are waiting actually to, today is May 2nd, but they are waiting to see that how much actually Iranian oil supply is going to be excluded from the market, how much Iran can smuggle or sell informally, and if U.S. government would come up with some sort of sanction, some sort of waivers, formally or informally. So they would wait and see that how much actually Iranian oil supply is going to be removed from the market, and then act accordingly to manage the market and substitute Iranian oil.
But it only takes one event to spook the markets. Only a week or so ago, Russia had to tell Europeans that the oil pumped through a pipeline was contaminated. You look at the other unpredictable things that are going on right now in Libya and in Venezuela. Is there going to be blowback here for the United States and for President Trump?
It's a very, very good question, because even if we have Saudi Arabia and OPEC covering for Iranian oil, again, most of this substitution would come from Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is a country and a major OPEC member that has the highest spare capacity in the market. So if we want Saudi Arabia to cover for Iranian oil with its spare capacity, and OPEC and Russia, then if there is any other event, the market would not have enough spare capacity to cover for that, and to in an event of any major incident, and that would have a significant impact on the prices. Also, beside that, we have Iranian that they're constantly threatening the market that if they cannot export any oil, they're going to either close the Strait of Hormuz or retaliate on a global oil flow. So all of these also could create potentially a psychological impact on the prices. However, as of now, looking at the future prices, we don't see any psychological impact. The future prices of oil for the next few months, they are not significantly higher. So the market hasn't been panicked yet. But yes, if there is any incident, then there's going to be a major effect on the prices.
With Iran's economy the way that it is, it needs to sell oil. You talked about Iran possibly getting oil covertly to market. How might it do that?
Well, Iran has still its own ways to, you might want to call it a smuggle or informally sell its oil, and they have done it before. There is our estimate, historical estimate, is that under the nuclear sanctions between 2012 and until end of 2015, Iran was able to smuggle about 150 to 200,000 barrels of oil to the market a day, and this is the amount that Iran could still sell in the black market, but it's not very significant if you compare it with 2.7 million barrels of export back in April 2018. Also, what we expect is that still Iran might deliver oil to China and India as part of certain debts that it has to these countries as a debt payment. So we might still see some Iranian oil shipment to these countries. So we do not expect that Iranian oil export would go to an actual zero. It might remain somewhere between 200 to 500,000 barrels per day.
But to what extent, in the long term, is President Trump here playing with fire? Will there be pushback from countries like you mentioned, China, Turkey as well? Geopolitically, is this going to cause trouble for him?
Well, if there is enough supply in a market and market is calm, we expect that these countries would comply with U.S. Sanctions. Particularly, China is a very interesting case because historically China never complied with U.S. sanctions. Again, going back to nuclear sanctions during President Obama, China was on average importing about 600,000 barrels of oil a day, which means that it was not really in compliance with U.S. sanctions. But this time, during the new sets of sanctions under President Trump, China was really in a very full compliance with U.S. sanctions, which was very historic. And what is interesting is that China-U.S. relation in terms of especially energy trade is going to a new era. And all we look is on the trade war and trade agreement, but it's kind of what we call it a pre-marriage conflict between the two countries. They're setting their terms because if you look at it, China is now this year the highest, is going to be record the highest importer of LNG. So China's appetite for oil and gas could be supplied by U.S., but also U.S. is a country that China could have investment and stakes in its oil and gas production. What we observe is that Chinese refineries and companies, they were very hesitant to enter any business or support of Iran under the sanctions to conflict their interest with United States.
Doctor, it's great to talk to you again on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us, Dr. Sara Bakhshuri.
Thank you.
Now, a young inventor developed technology to make the screen on our mobile phones stronger and more scratch-resistant. He sent his product to a Chinese tech giant, but the diamond glass returned broken with fragments missing. Now, that raised suspicions and led to an FBI sting. Al Jazeera's John Hendren reports.
This is the story about a small American technology startup, a giant Chinese conglomerate, and industrial espionage. It starts here in Illinois, where Adam Kahn formed a company, Acon Semiconductor, where they make a kind of glass for cell phones that is said to be 6 times stronger than the industry standard. So you can drop it and it won't break. And it looks something like that. He was looking for a manufacturer to make it, and among the companies he talked to were Huawei of China. They had a facility in California, so he sent them a sample with 2 provisions. First, they could not damage it. That's standard protection against industrial espionage. And second, they couldn't take it out of the country because it's made with a kind of industrial diamond-like material that has military properties and is illegal to export from the United States. Nevertheless, it was returned months later and broken. That was when the company thought perhaps they were being ripped off by the Chinese. So they spoke to the FBI, who examined the sample and determined that it had been cut by a military-strength industrial laser, and there were pieces missing, which suggested the Chinese had held on to them to examine it. But it's part of a wide-ranging probe into Huawei by companies and the U.S. government. In fact, the CFO of Huawei faces charges in Brooklyn. The company just settled a suit in Washington state where it is alleged to have stolen part of a robot owned by T-Mobile. The robot was called Tappy, by the way. And the Trump administration is urging American companies not to use Huawei's 5G technology. That's because they're afraid that the company is installing a back door that would allow them to listen to Americans and possibly engage in cyber warfare. As for the Acon technology you see here, you might look for it one day soon on a cell phone near you. Adam Kahn of Acon Semiconductor, thank you for being with Counting the Cost.
Thank you for having me.
First off, you've got this nearly unbreakable smartphone glass technology. What is it, and how did you come up with it?
So our Mirage diamond glass technology is actually a lab-grown nanocrystalline diamond. It has all of the material properties that you would find in bulk diamond. It's exceptional hardness. It's exceedingly high thermal conductivity. It's an exceptionally robust material. It's chemically inert, biologically inert, as well as having the optics that you'd require from a display glass. So we've married a very thin layer of nanodiamond with display glass, creating the world's first display technology for cell phone, smartphone, and consumer-facing technologies.
How could it revolutionize the smartphone industry, and what other applications does it have?
So right now, the glass that the majority of smartphones use, this chemically hardened aluminosilica glass, was actually pioneered in the 1960s. Not a lot has been done in terms of innovating that glass, which is why every time we drop our phone, we see these spiderweb cracks, these break lines. Diamond being exceptionally hard and being scratch resistant not only helps with that break strength, but also when you're carrying around your cell phone in your bag, alongside with you, keys, things that would normally abrade the material no longer do. So you will no longer need this protective top coat to protect the surface. It'll also be a stronger display for drop protection. And as we move to technologies like foldable smartphone, this will be even more important because we already see cracks and creases being formed in those glass types.
So you were looking for a partner to manufacture this in a phone, and one of the companies you talked to was Huawei of China. What happened?
So Huawei at the time was the third largest, now they're the second largest smartphone manufacturer worldwide. They had actually reached out to us, seeing some of these breakthrough announcements and white paper conference proceedings that we had pursued. They were very interested in the technology for their flagship smartphone as well as for their smartwatch, and we began the engagement with them in 2016. Around 2017, we started shipping samples for their evaluation. The samples came back damaged, and in the last instance, we actually saw that they retained a portion of this sample, which prompted the events that followed.
And what exactly did follow? After that sample was broken, the last one, you ended up talking to the FBI.
We did. So we noticed that the sample, when it was returned to this facility here in Gurnee, Illinois, that a good portion of it was missing from these pieces. This is not something that could be done in shipping. Again, this is exceptionally hard material, and it was also packed rather airtight, so that way it could be insensitive to things like vibrational and handling. So we knew right away that there was an issue. We had contacted our contacts at the FBI Chicago field office, with whom we were previously acquainted from some technology executive briefings, and we'd asked for their help to do some analysis on this, and sure enough, their finding was that the sample was intentionally cleaved using a high-intensity laser.
And that's when this becomes a kind of James Bond story. Your company contacts the FBI. The FBI asks your company to become essentially industrial spies for the government.
I look at it more so that we were looking to protect our technology, and the FBI recognizing the breakthrough of the technology platform, not necessarily ACON specifically, but the importance of diamond technology, readily stepped up to help us protect and to reclaim this technology.
Tell me about that meeting with Huawei officials in Las Vegas, where you had people who were mic'd up. It didn't go entirely as planned. What happened?
Well, I guess as they usually say that anything that can happen will happen during these sort of instances. But yes, we met with Huawei at the Consumer Electronics Show, again, to get on record that they had willfully exported this technology and willfully infringed or attempted to reverse engineer our technology. From their perspective, they were, during the meeting, still attempting to be the exclusive licensee of our technology, asking things like when we were going to ramp, when we were going to bring this technology to market, and were they available to still pursue the exclusive. So from their perspective, I think they were doing a little bit more digging to understand now the scaling and operation side, having some material in hand. From our perspective, we wanted to document beyond any reasonable doubt what they had attempted to do, which was steal our technology.
So you had a conversation, it was recorded. As I understand it, the Chinese admitted that they did send the sample for testing in China, which, as you understand it, is a violation of U.S. law. And they asked whether the U.S. government was listening to that conversation.
They actually went a step beyond that. They had said, we looked into it, and we said that they thought that they could willfully, or they could legally export the technology. So again, even though our paperwork had explicitly stated, stateside only, do not export, they admitted, again, that they looked into it and believed that they could do so. And I pointed out during that meeting, diamond is part of the EAR, the Export and Arms Restricted Materials, which has heavy criminal jail time as well as actual fines associated with it.
So where are we now? Where does that investigation lie, and where do things lie between your company and Huawei?
So the Department of Justice is still pursuing the case against Huawei, and Acon Semiconductor plans to file civil litigation in tandem with those charges. We are not privy to the Department of Justice's timetable, nor do we believe we ought to be, but we sit patiently waiting to play our part in that proceeding. With Huawei directly, I was actually at the Huawei San Diego facility yesterday, just before this, again, to ask for our sample materials. I noticed that particular location has changed their name to FutureWay. And again, I've given the runaround that they would get back to us with respect to the sample status. So again, from their perspective, I think they're denying or playing in the dark with respect to where the samples lie. It's our belief that these materials are still in China, which is exceptionally problematic for us.
Adam Kahn of Acon Semiconductor, thank you for talking to us at Counting the Cost.
Thank you.
Fascinating. Well, that's our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've seen, you can tweet me. I'm at @Finnegan on Twitter. Please use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us a line. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find individual reports, links, even entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. In Doha, I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team here. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.